Express Pro Tip, and this tip is for Express programmers who write their Express application using TypeScript. Have you ever done this kind of pattern where you have to access some data on the request object? For example, here I'm trying to access request.user, and if you're writing TypeScript, have you ever stumbled on a case where TypeScript is not familiar that the request object of Express contains some sort of data that you're trying to access? In this example, user, but it can be other data as well. So if you ever stumbled on this kind of pattern where TypeScript is not familiar with this kind of data on the Express request object, and have you ever done this mistake to solve this problem? Obviously now my code will not TypeScript compile. So have you ever solved this kind of problem using this? I take request and I cast it as any. Listen, Express, just disregard every check you have on the request object in this line because I want to access data that you're not familiar with. So in general, our preference when using TypeScript is to try to avoid the cast to any as much as we can. When we do cast to any, we're losing a lot of the TypeScript safety, and we're basically throwing our exceptions and errors to runtime instead of compile time. So we do like the TypeScript compiler those checks, and in Express, we often piggyback data on the request object, and TypeScript is not familiar with that data. So this is considered as bad practice and is not recommended. So how do we solve it? How do we teach TypeScript about the request object that we are adding data to it and what kind of type of data we're adding to it? In this lesson, we will learn how to teach TypeScript about the request object, how to teach TypeScript about additional data that we're adding on the request object. We'll learn about how to do it using declaration files. Declaration files is an important mechanism where we can use to teach the TypeScript compiler about additional stuff that the TypeScript compiler is not aware of. Here's our plan for this lesson. So basically, we're giving here a professional tip regarding using Express with TypeScript. So we'll start by creating an Express application using TypeScript. We will then go and talk about the common pattern in Express where you add data to the request object. I call it piggyback the request object, and you can see it in popular middleware like, for example, cookie parser. Cookie parser will add to the request object a cookies property. You can see it in Express session middleware where Express session takes the request object and adds a property of session. You can see it in Passport, a popular authentication library where Passport is taking the request object and is adding the user. So we'll talk about this common pattern in Express, and then we'll talk about a problem with that pattern in TypeScript. TypeScript is not aware of those added data and their types, and will often mark those data on the request object, will mark them as TypeScript exceptions because TypeScript does not know that they exist on the Express request object. Here we stumble on a way to teach TypeScript about new things, about extending the request object, about that data on the request object, and we'll talk about declaration files. Those will be the mechanism we will use to teach TypeScript about the data we're adding on the request object. And we're talking about the declaration files. I'm talking about those files that end with .d.ts where you can teach TypeScript new stuff. Those files are simply for the TypeScript compiler. They do not transform to JS files, and you use them to teach the TypeScript compiler about new stuff. So we'll learn in this lesson how to leverage declaration files to teach TypeScript new stuff and make TypeScript throw more exceptions on the compile time and use our advantage of a TypeScript in our Express application. We will then show different examples of where you should use this declaration files, common patterns, and places where you will have to use this technique to teach TypeScript about the added request data about data that you added to the request object. We'll show popular example where you should use it in your app. To demonstrate declaration files, we will have to create a simple Express and TypeScript application. So create an empty folder and open that folder in VS Code. Let's initiate npm in this folder by typing npm init ---- yes. This will create a package.json file, and let's start by installing TypeScript with the command npm install or -d TypeScript. After TypeScript is installed, let's create a tsconfig JSON file with npx tsc -- init. This will create a tsconfig file, and in this tsconfig file, so we can run our code in VS Code, let's open the tsconfig file, search for source map, and enable source map, set it to true. This will enable us to run our code using VS Code debugger. Great. So let's close this file, and let's start by creating a simple Express application that prints hello world. So for this, we're going to have to install Express. Open the terminal and then type npm install or I Express. This will install Express. We are going also to already include some declaration files in our project by installing npm I -d types Express. And we're going to talk about DefinitelyTyped and those types declaration file that you can install and use for now. But let's quickly start our project and talk about it in later in this lesson. So installing Express and types Express. Now create the file app ts. Now this is going to be we'll create a simple server that returns hello world. So we are going to create a simple server that returns an hello world message to the user. So let's create an Express application. I'm going to import the function in Express that creates application, an Express application, and I'm going to create a simple application using that function. And I'm going to do get and respond with hello world. And I am going to open a port in port 3000 and print a message when my server is opening. Great. Now, if everything works properly, I should be able to launch this project and see the result in the browser. So I am going to go to the Run and Debug menu and going to Run and Debug and place a breakpoint here. Run and Debug with Node.js. And of course, I need also to compile my app. So before you can run your app, open the terminal and do an npx tsc -w. This will launch the TypeScript compiler in watch mode. So every change, TypeScript will recompile our files. So there are 0 errors during the compilation. Let's try and run and debug our code. Again, run and debug. Okay, now our server is running. Let's go to the browser, and if everything works correctly, we should see an hello world printed. So let's go to localhost 3000. We see hello world message. Great. This will be our starting point. This project will be our starting point to learn about the request object type and how do I use declaration files to extend that request type. Examining the different types that we have here in our app, although we didn't specify any TypeScript type here, implicitly the request, the response, app.get, everything here has the app itself. Everything here in this small app actually has a TypeScript type that is implicitly added to it. We can make things a bit clearer. The create application is returning type application. So this app is of type Express application. Now I don't actually need to specify the type here. It's implicitly, TypeScript already knows it by looking at the create application function and seeing what this function is returning. Since this function, if I control click it, I see that it returns core Express, then TypeScript already knows that type here, and the core Express is extending an application. So I don't actually need to specify the types, but already, since you already without typing explicitly the types, every element here already has a type declared. Let's continue this example. For example, the get, TypeScript exactly knows what the get should get, and it's a string, and those request response object also has a type. So you can see that the type here is type request and the type here is type response. So the request here is of type request. And again, you don't need to specify it. TypeScript already knows by looking at the get function. He knows the app type, so he knows what the get is, and he knows what the get is expecting to get in the function, and thus he knows every one of these types. But just to clarify things, let's specify the types here. And this is pretty much the types that I have in my app. Now I can further examine each type, but by control clicking. For example, if I control click the request, I go to a declaration file, which we will talk about soon. But I'll see, let's control click and reveal in Explorer view. I actually go to the node module types to the Express folder. Remember, I installed npm install -d types express, and I actually go to here and I go to the interface request here, which extends core request. Now core request, let's see this file as well. Let's reveal in Explorer view. This ships with another types which we didn't explicitly install. Rather, it was implicitly installed by installing the Express type. When you install the Express type, it said dependencies types Express serve static. So when you install npm install types, sometimes you install additional, the package you install actually installed additional dependencies packages. So the Express type is not actually one file. The majority of the Express types is declared in the Express serve static core in the npm types folder. And in here you'll find, for example, let's see what's defined in this file. We'll go over it. There's a namespace express, and inside it the request object. So basically you're taking the request object from here. We'll need this information later on when we talk about declaration files. But bear in mind that everything here has its type. Everything here is static. Although we didn't define the types, TypeScript already knows the type, and this is the main player that we're going to talk about during this lesson. We're going to talk about the request type and how do we extend that request type. Now that we went over the different types we have that when we created an Express application, let's talk about the request type for a second and talk about a common pattern where you piggyback data, where you're adding data to the request object. So it's common pattern in Express to take the request object and add data to the request object. It's a form of communication where a middleware can add data to the request object, and by doing so transfer that data to the next middlewares or route handlers. So I take the request object and I can add data to it, and we see this pattern repeating in a lot of middlewares. For example, let's see it in code. We have request cookies, request body, request session, and passport as well. So let's see an example here. In our code, we can go to the request object and go and try to access cookies. And this data on the request object is added if you install the cookie parser. So let's do that for a second. Let's open a terminal and npm install cookie parser. So if you install the cookie parser, you can then import the cookie parser from your cookie parser. Now Express is not familiar. This is a JavaScript package. So in order for Express to work with this package, we also need to install the types of cookie parser. So for example, if you install app.use the middleware cookie parser, this middleware will add piggyback data on the request object, and what it will add to the request object is an object. It will basically go over the cookie header and then place the cookies arranged in an object that is placed on the request.cookies. For example, if you let's do another one. Request body. So you have also in the request body. Now this is populated if you do app.use. Inside Express, we have URL encoded or JSON. This both middleware is basically doing the same thing, only for different requests sent. So they basically parse the body that is sent with the request. So if I'm doing app use JSON, it will take the body from request with content type application JSON. So basically request that a body is arranged in a JSON format. They will parse that body and place it in the request object, adding data, piggybacking data on the request object, the body property. Same thing was app.use use URL encoded. So URL encoded is also basically a type where we encode body in the request, only the content type is not application JSON. I forgot what it is, but basically it parses a different kind of way where we pass data through the body, and also it will add the request.body to the request object. Another example, if you install the Express session middleware, this will add to the request a data of session. So we notice that it's a common pattern in Express Express to take the request object and add data, piggyback data. This is a form of communication where one middleware can pass information and data to the following middlewares. So we saw that many middlewares adding data to the request object in order to communicate with further middlewares and route handlers. Let's do the same. Let's create a localization middleware that will add a locale information on the request object. So I'll go back and I'll delete all the usage of the cookie parser and the URL encoded, all those middlewares that we added to see example of other middlewares that are adding data to the request object. I'll delete everything and just keep the hello world application that we created earlier. And now I want to create a middleware of my own. So I'll do, and the middleware I'm going to create, this middleware will add to the request object locale property that contains a string with the language that is currently set. So let's say it's containing a string of en marking English. So I'll do an app.use and I'll add a middleware function, and I'll have a request, response, and next in this function. And what I want to do is to take the request object and I want to add data to the request object. So I'll add a locale property and I'll mark it as English. Now notice something interesting. The request object is of type request. The type request is of type request, and that type request does not contain locale property. So TypeScript is complaining about us trying to add data that does not exist on the object itself. So a bad pattern will be to take the request object and do something like this: request as any. And right, this makes TypeScript doesn't even check about the request objects, and thus this line is okay. But this is considered bad practice. In fact, if you can, try to avoid the use of casting to any, because basically you're saying, hey, I'm lazy, I don't want TypeScript static changes, I don't want TypeScript checks. And basically what you're doing is you're throwing more errors to runtime instead of utilizing the advantages of TypeScript detecting errors at compile time. So this kind of pattern where you're lazy and casting to any is it's better to avoid that pattern. So how can we solve that? How can we do a piggyback on the request object, add data to the request object while still informing TypeScript, hey, look TypeScript, you actually have additional data on the request object. How do I teach TypeScript about the data that I want to add to the request object? The way we are going to teach the TypeScript compiler about new things is using a declaration file. So with declaration file, we can teach the TypeScript compiler about things that the TypeScript compiler is not aware of. For example, our request that containing a locale information TypeScript does not know about, we can teach TypeScript that the request object contains a string of locale. By the way, we forgot to add a next in our middleware that to pass along the request to the next middleware. So we can teach the TypeScript compiler about new things using the declaration file. Now, those declaration files are files that have the end that ends with .d.ts. Those are files that do not transform to JavaScript. They are simply helper declaration files for the compiler. They are not transformed to a JavaScript file. For example, in this code example, we see that we teach the TypeScript compiler that there is a global variable named foo of type string. Now, the way we are going to teach TypeScript that the request object, we basically are going to extend the request object. We're going to add properties to the request object. We're going to tell TypeScript the request object that is familiar from Express is actually containing more properties. And the way we can do that is by utilizing a declaration files functionality in TypeScript that is called declaration merging. In declaration merging, you can declare one declaration file and another declaration file, and they both append to the same type. So basically, in this example, we see that we created a namespace named foo, and in one declaration file that contains the variable bar, which is string, and we created another declaration file with the same namespace foo. Now this time the property is named foo, which is a string. So basically we constructed from two different declaration files, we constructed one big namespace of foo that containing the property bar and foo. So basically we extended a namespace. We added more properties to the namespace. And then TypeScript recognized that on the global scope, they have a foo namespace with a bar and a foo namespace with a foo. So we use declaration merging to add data to existing types. And the same concept we can use to take the type of the request object and use declaration merging to add types, to add properties, to add data to the request object. So let's go back to our IDE and create our first declaration file. As a reminder, what we're trying to do is to piggyback on the request object a locale property. And we don't want to cast anytime we want to access that property or write to that property. We don't want to cast the request object as any and every time. So we'd actually want Typescript to be aware of the additional data that we want to add in the request object. So let's create a new file. And as we said, declaration files are files that are ending in .d.ts. So let's create that file. We'll name that file locale.d.ts. So this is our first declaration file. So what we want to do in this declaration file, we want to tell TypeScript to grab the request object from the request type from Express and add from Express and add the locale property using declaration merging. Okay, so we actually wanted to tell TypeScript, look, you have a declaration file in Express that describes the request object, but what we want to do is we want to add additional fields to that request object. And TypeScript is doing declaration merging, meaning that when it calculates the request object, it can add additional data that we're adding. So first, let's take the request object by importing everything from the Express declaration. This is how TypeScript will know that we are referencing types from the Express types. And now we can examine how Express declares namespace, and in that namespace it declares the Express. Let's go to Express serve static core. So what Express is doing, it's declaring in the global, it's declaring a namespace called Express, and in that namespace Express is declaring an interface for the request object. And what we can do is we can override the declare global, the namespace Express, and add to the interface of the request. So going back to the declaration file that we created, let's go to declare global. And let's grab a namespace Express, like here. I'm sorry, a bit lost with the indentation. Grab the namespace Express, and then we'll take the interface of request. And in the interface of request, we can now add additional data. So we're saying that the request object actually has a locale property, and the locale property can be either the string English, or it can be either the string French, or either the string Hebrew. And we actually taught TypeScript about additional fields that we have on the request object. And obviously, you can add additional fields of your own. And middlewares that you install often will take the, for example, middlewares that piggyback data on the request object will often do the same approach. They will override the namespace Express, the interface request, and then add additional data to that request object. Now, in order for TypeScript to be aware of the additional declaration file, we need to tell TypeScript to include this file. So by default, if you go to tsconfig.json and you do not specify include or files, then what TypeScript, the default option is to just include every TypeScript file as well as every declaration file. So we don't actually need to tell TypeScript to include our declaration file, because by default it will just include all the TypeScript and declaration file there is. So going back to app.ts, we now see the request locale error is gone. And actually, if we go mouse over the locale, we see that it can be type of, it's not even a string. It could be English, French, or Hebrew. So if I try to pass English, it will error out. So try to be also specific with your type. It's not necessarily a string. You can actually say it's some sort of strings, not all the strings, but English, EN, he or fr. So what I did is, let's go back to the declaration file. I imported from Express. This is causing the declare global, declare a namespace of Express, and then I can start playing with that namespace and going appending to the request, to the response. Basically, if you go to the Express and you go to the Express serve static core, you can see how Express declared their types, and using declaration merging, we can override every one of those types that are listed here. So we managed to use declaration file to teach the TypeScript compiler about added data that we're adding to the request object. Let's give another example. This time we're going to use a middleware, very popular middleware called Passport. Passport is the most popular authentication middleware for Express. Basically, you can take Passport, you can attach to Passport different strategies, and using different strategies, you can authenticate in different ways. So if I want to authenticate the users using, for example, JWT, JSON Web Token, I can tell Passport to use a JWT strategy, and then my application can authenticate the user with JWT. This is a simplistic form of how we work with Passport authentication. So after authentication, Passport will use the piggyback on the request object pattern, and Passport will add to the request object a property called request.user. You can also change that if you want to request dot instead of user, make Passport put it on a different property, but the default is that Passport will piggyback on the request object, adding on the request object request.user. So what we'll do now, we'll try to work with Passport. We'll go back to our code and try to install Passport and examine another example of declaration file where we can teach the TypeScript compiler about Passport. So going back to my code, I'll open the terminal and I'm going to have the TypeScript compiler running, so I'll close this and I'm going to npm install Passport. So great, Passport is installed, and now after Passport is installed, I can go back to my app.ts, and what I can do, I can import the Passport, import Passport from Passport. Now Passport is a JavaScript package, which means this package only contains JavaScript file and it does not contain TypeScript file or TypeScript declaration file. This means that by default, if we point to Passport, TypeScript will not know how to handle this library. Now, usually we will first check, we will try to teach TypeScript about the Passport library, and the way we usually do it is by searching something called DefinitelyTyped. DefinitelyTyped is a library that contains different declaration files defining JavaScript libraries. So we'll talk about DefinitelyTyped in a minute. Let's try to solve this in a more naive approach, just to understand about declaration files a bit more. So what I'm about to show now, this is not how we would solve the problem of teaching TypeScript about the Passport library. We would do it with DefinitelyTyped, installing npm install types Passport. But let's take the naive approach to learn a bit about declaration file. So usually I would go to, if I'm importing something that doesn't contain declaration file, TypeScript will complain and say Passport is declared, could not find a declaration file for module Passport. And now if I want, for example, to Passport authenticate, for example, I want to use passport.authenticate authenticate with JWT, obviously TypeScript does not know how to handle the authenticate method here. We can pass JWT and we can pass session false, do not use session, and this is in general function that Passport contains, which authenticates the middleware against authenticates the user against JWT before continuing to the next route middleware. So basically what we're saying here, only a JWT authenticated user can see this hello world. And TypeScript won't compile this, and if we open the terminal and try npx tsc-w, compile the files, and same as VS Code marking this will be marked with the TypeScript compiler as well. So let's try to solve it in the naive approach. We can teach TypeScript, right? We said that declaration files is a way for us to teach the TypeScript compiler about new things. So I'm going to go back to my file explorer and I'm going to create a new file, and I'll call it Passport .d.ts. Remember, declaration files end with DTS. And now I can do something like this. I can tell TypeScript, let's declare module passport. I can tell TypeScript declare module passport, and I can say that the passport module contains an, now if I save this and go back to my app, now I see that passport is recognized, right? We set the TypeScript, listen, you have a module called passport, and now TypeScript doesn't complain about this, but TypeScript does complain about the authenticate method, because basically we go back to the file, we declared an empty module. So we can say, okay, look, I have here an authenticate method, and that let's do export authenticate, which is of type, and the authenticate is a type function which returns, let's say it returns any, and the function gets, let's say it gets authenticate with, which is a string, and options, which is any. So I'm exporting, let's say, I'm exporting the authenticate method, which is, I declared this method as that the passport module has an authenticate method. And if I go back to my file, now I see that the authenticate is recognized, and it's a function with string as the first argument, and option is any, and returns any. So this time TypeScript does not compile, and if we go back to our code, we see 0 errors. So what we did here is we took package that is written with JavaScript, and then we created a declaration file for that package, teaching TypeScript about this package and what kind of function it contains. Of course, we can take an even easier route and not contain authenticate as a function. We can just say this is any, and this way we'll tell TypeScript, the authenticate method, don't check that method. So one of the questions that I get asked when I teach TypeScript is there a limitation? Is there, for example, libraries that I cannot, that are written in JavaScript that I cannot use with TypeScript? And the answer is no. There is no limitation. You can even use JavaScript libraries that don't have a declaration file indefinitely typed, or the community didn't create a declaration file for that library. You can still go about and teach TypeScript compiler about that library yourself. So there is really no limitation. There is no library that you cannot use with TypeScript, because you have the ability to teach TypeScript about that library. And this is what we did here with Passport. Now, this is not how you usually teach TypeScript about libraries, especially popular libraries like Passport. You usually use something that is called DefinitelyTyped to teach TypeScript about libraries like Passport. So usually in the popular libraries like Passport, you won't create the declaration file yourself. Even though Passport is a JavaScript library, you still don't have to create the declaration file, because there is a community project called DefinitelyTyped, which basically it's an open source place for developers to create declaration files for certain libraries. So, and the same thing happened with Passport. Passport has a declaration file in the DefinitelyTyped project. Now, the way it works, you don't have, for the popular libraries, you won't have to create the declaration files yourself, and you'll use DefinitelyTyped, which pretty much means you'll npm install a package that starts with @types, and that package will contain declaration file for the library. So usually you have to install the types and the package that you want declaration files for. So in our example, if we want declaration files for Passport, we'll npm install types passport. And let's see that in action and try to solve our Passport problem using DefinitelyTyped project and installing the types passport package. So let's go back to our app. Instead of creating a Passport declaration files ourselves, let's delete this file. So I'll delete this file. If I'll go back to my project, I see that now TypeScript complains about Passport. It is not aware, Passport does not contain declaration files, so TypeScript does not know what to do with the Passport module. So what we will do is we will close the TypeScript compiler, and we're going to npm install -d, and we're going to install types passport. And basically, the DefinitelyTyped, those are packages that you can see installed in the node modules @types folder. You see those different definitely typed packages that are installed. And each one of those packages doesn't contain really a JavaScript file. They simply contain declarations file. So if we install Passport, we'll see that in the Passport folder, we now installed a declaration file, index.dts. And so all the packages in definitely typed, you have tons of example of declaration files in that folder. Because every JavaScript library that is popular, someone probably created a definitely typed project. Maybe the authors of the package themselves created it, and there is a declaration file describing different libraries. So this is I think the #1 place to actually learn how to create declaration file. Just check out those packages and examine those declaration file yourself. And here we're examining the Passport declaration file. So we'll see that they declared global. They override the namespace Express in order to add some stuff to the request object. For example, in the request object, they're adding the user data. If you remember, we talked about Passport. After Passport authenticates the user, they piggyback on the request object a user property. So you see how they declared and expanded the Express.Request object and added the user property. So you can actually learn how other libraries, other Express middlewares are overriding the request object and doing the same thing we did with the Locale declaration file. They're doing the same, only they're adding their data that they want to add on the request object. So you have endless example of how to create declaration file by just examining those packages from definitely typed. After we install the Passport declaration files, now, if we go back to our code, we see that the Typescript does not complain about the Passport package anymore, and it does not complain about the Passport authenticate. And if you go to the Passport authenticate, you are redirected. Control-click the authenticate, you are redirected to a place in the index declaration file in Passport. So in here, you have the authenticate method declared in the Passport declaration that we just installed in definitely typed. And you don't have to do anything. You simply have to install the definitely typed package using npm install with types and the package that you want to install declaration file for. By default, those packages that are located in the types folder in the node modules, by default, they are included in the Typescript. The Typescript compiler already includes them by default. So even though we didn't do anything, Typescript compiler will process the Passport declaration file when you're doing an import Passport from Passport. So Typescript will automatically include that declaration file by default. So here, this is the better solution. So we didn't create a declaration file. We saw that it's best to first look that there isn't a community declaration file in the definitely typed project before you're starting to create your own declarations file. So at the first, we created our own Passport declaration file, but actually this is a much better solution. Just if you're using a library and Typescript and that library does not contain declaration file, search for the definitely typed project if you can npm install types with the library to get the community declaration files. So we have Passport, a JavaScript library, and we managed to teach Typescript about the Passport library by installing the definitely typed declaration files of Passport. By simply doing npm install types Passport, we basically taught Typescript about the Passport package. Now I want to examine the Passport declaration file and maybe do a little bit of exercise where we override the Passport declaration file. So if we examine the Passport declaration file, and we can do that by control-clicking the Passport here, we'll notice that the Typescript declaration file is doing something that we did with the Locale by adding properties to the request object. What they're doing is they are taking the request, which belongs to the Express namespace, which belongs to global, exposing us the request to override. Passport is doing something similar, and they're adding a user property. So going back to our code, we can now have a request.userProperty. After we install the Passport declaration file, those declaration files are extending the request object, and they're teaching Typescript that the request object has another property called user. Now the user type we can see is of type user or undefined. Control-clicking the user type will lead you to a place where you can examine what type it is, and it's of type user or undefined. And what is the type user? The type user is simply an empty interface. And when a library does create this empty interface under Express, it's a way for you to override that interface. It's like a gateway for Passport to tell you, hey, we have an empty interface for user, but if you want, using declaration merging, you can replace the user with your own user. So I don't want this empty interface. Rather, what I want to do is I want to create a new file. Let's call this file user, and I want to create like a class of my own user. And my own user has a first name which is a string, name which is a string, a last name which is a string, and an age which is a number. Now I see an error when I created the class. If I place my mouse over the error, I can see property first name has no initializer. So one way to solve this is to add initializer. Just initialize the property. Another way you can solve this error is by telling Typescript that not all your fields has to be initialized. You can do it from the tsconfig. There is an option called strict property initialization. We can set this to false and go back to our user property, and it should be fine. The errors are gone now. So what I want to do is I want to take this user class that I created here, and I want Typescript to know that on the request object, the user property is not of the passport empty interface. Rather, the type is my own user type. And the way I can see that it's working is if I can access the first name here. So obviously, Typescript does not know the first name, so it complains. Basically, it complains in two places. One place is, look, the request user is possibly undefined, so I need to add a question mark here. That made the first error go away, and now I still have the second error, which, look, I don't have a first name in my user because my user is an empty interface right now. So what I need to do is to tell Typescript, look, the user interface is actually extending my own user. It's my own user type. So what I'll do is I'll create a declaration file where I will teach Typescript that the request.user is my own user type. So I'll create another declaration file. I'll call it passport.d.ts. And in this declaration file, I'm going to teach Typescript that request.user is my own class. And again, to do this, to know what you have to override, you have to know the declaration file that you are overriding. So what we're doing is we are going to passport declaration file, and we are overriding this interface user, changing it to be my own user. So I'm overriding the passport declaration file. So I'll import the passport declaration file, and now I will declare global like passport is doing, namespace express like passport is doing. Namespace express like passport is doing, interface user. And I want to change this. And I want to say that interface user is extending my own user. So I'll import my user. I'll import my user, and I'll say that the export interface user extends my user. Let's call it user as my user. So this extends my user. So let's go back to our code. We see that now the first name is gone. I actually taught Typescript that the user type is not passport empty user type, but it is my own user type. Understand the power that you have with declaration merging. You can see what a Typescript library is doing. Usually a lot of libraries will give you keys to a gateway to override something that they're not sure of, some type that they're not sure of. So they'll give you a gateway to use declaration merging to override that type. And this is what Passport did. Passport said, hey, I don't really know what the user type is. Just override it with your own user type. So I'll leave it as empty, but you can take that empty interface user and you can extend it with your own user. So understanding like declaration gives you a way to also override other libraries' type and setting it to the right types of your own. Don't do something like this, which I see a lot. Since the user is not an empty generic passport, usually what I see for a beginner TypeScript user is doing something like this: request.user as any or as my user. just casting it. Don't do that every time you're using the user property. Rather, teach TypeScript. If this is the type and you have to cast this, do that casting every time you access the user. If you need to keep that repeating code, this actually means that you probably do not need to cast. Rather, you need to probably teach TypeScript about the correct user type that TypeScript has. So we managed to do some pretty good teaching of the TypeScript compiler, teaching the TypeScript about new types you want to add to the request object, overriding interfaces from Passport, and there's a lot of things that you can do using declaration files, which every time you stumble on something that TypeScript does not know, declaration file is your key to teach TypeScript about that new type. Now, when you add declaration files for your project, it's important to know which declaration file is included. Sometimes it's not simply adding .d.ts file, because sometimes your TypeScript compiler cannot find that declaration file. So let's go over a few properties that you should know in the tsconfig, which are different ways you can include declaration file in your TypeScript. So what we are looking for is in the tsconfig.json file. So going back to our code, the tsconfig.json file is pretty much where TypeScript will look when it looks for which files to compile, which declaration files to include. So TypeScript will examine the tsconfig file to understand that. And by default, we have a few things that are specified here, which made our life a bit easier, because we could simply add a DTS file and it would simply be included. And the reason it's included is the default behavior of the tsconfig, even if you do not specify, is to add an include option that includes all the files from your root folder, all the TypeScript file and declaration file. So even if we did not specify the include you add patterns of the TypeScript file and declaration files that you want included in your project. So you can say, okay, I want only the files that I don't want to compile the test file. So I'll include all the files and I'll exclude maybe the spec.ts file. I'll include only the files under source and not the files under test. So the include allows you to add certain patterns of the files that you want to be included in your project. And by default, it includes all the source files, all the TS and declaration files under the project that we're currently in. So that made our life a bit easier, because we could simply add a DTS file and it would be included. So this is one option that you can specify patterns here, including declaration file patterns, to include declaration files in your project. So the include is one property in the tsconfig that you can use. Another property is files. If you don't want to specify patterns of TypeScript file, you can add specific files. This is good if you're writing a package and you want only certain files to be included. So the files is also an array that you can specify, and an array of certain files that you want to be included. And in here, you can also specify declaration files. So add all the TS files and declaration files, and TypeScript will include those declaration files and files. Another option that we have is type roots. Again, we didn't specify anything in the type roots. Let's examine this here. So we have the type roots, which the default is, it's basically what allows TypeScript to include all the declaration files under node module types. Remember that we installed DefinitelyTyped, we added npm install types passport, and this in turn placed declaration files in node modules in the types directory. Now, the reason TypeScript knows to include those files, even if we do not specify any of those files, even if you do not specify, for example, going to our app, even if you do not import passport and you're not going to passport authenticate here, even if you do not include passport at all, still TypeScript knows about request user. And the reason it knows is that by default, the type roots is pointing to the types folder. So everything that your npm installed types, all the declaration files in the types folder are already, TypeScript is already processing those declaration files. So this is the default behavior. So if you want to change that or add additional folders, you can add additional folders with packages to include for TypeScript. TypeScript will, if you go to tsconfig and you specify type roots, you can say, okay, I want the node modules types folder, as well as I want to add my own declaration folder. Maybe I have a types directory, so I want also the types directory. Okay, so you can add additional folders other than the types for additional declaration files that you want to be included. Let's restore this to the default. And the last option that you can use to specify declaration file is using the type select certain packages from type root. So by default, everything in the types folder are included, but I can limit that. So I can add types an array in the types config. Maybe I have an example here. In the types config, I can add additional array, and those are the only packages that they will be taken from type roots. So for example, if in the types I'm including only Express, then it will include only in the types Express folder, and it will not include, for example, passport. So those are different files, different configurations that you perhaps need to know to include your declaration files. But remember, the default is to include all TypeScript and declaration files. So the defaults are pretty good. Also, the type roots points to the types folder, which is also a good default. So maybe the default option is enough for you, which is fine. But if not, and you see your declaration file is not included, check out these properties from the tsconfig to include your declaration file. Okay, we're pretty much at the end of this lesson. What is important for me to emphasize is that if you see that in your Express code you have to do many lines like request as any, request as request.user as my user. If you have to do a lot of casting of data in the request object, stop doing that. Perhaps you need to stop doing those casting and think about, wait a minute, maybe I'll take a minute to teach TypeScript about the things that I cast all the time, to teach TypeScript that the request object contain additional data. So stop all those casting. And it's not only, by the way, it's not only true for Express, it's true in general. If you need to do multiple, you see that you keep on doing casting because TypeScript compiler is not aware of certain data type, certain library, just hold on a second, create a declaration file, and wait 1 second and teach TypeScript about that type instead of doing all those casting again and again. Remember, if you're doing a request as any, if you're adding cast to any, this considered as bad practice. This is you saying, TypeScript, I want to cancel your checking on this current line. So stop doing that as well. There's a lot of power in declaration file, and you have a lot of example in the node module types folder. You can see different example of libraries, create a declaration file, and learn from that how to create your own declaration file. So make sure to stop and teach TypeScript about those types that TypeScript is not aware of. That's it. Thank you for listening for our best practices tip, creating declaration file to extend your Express.Request project, Express.Request object, and learn about, in general, declaration file to teach TypeScript new stuff. Thank you for listening.